Axios tells us socialism is on the rise in America, sort of, and then it's time to get serious with how much socialism sucks. I'm Andrew Coppins, and welcome to a special 10-part series here on The Andrew Coppins Show. Yes, I said 10-part series, because it takes that much, if not more, to take on the creeping tide of socialism. Over the next 10 episodes, I'm going to break down the biggest tropes and myths supporters of socialism believe today. But you can't get to the finish line without the starting line, and that means we're starting from the very basics of socialism. What is it? And what do people today believe it to be? Why is that important? Well, as I mentioned on By the Numbers earlier this week over at Mojo 50 Radio, a large portion of those aged 18 to 38 seem to be confused by socialism. How else do you explain this Axios piece in which 49.6% of respondents believe in socialism and then turn around in the same study and support private healthcare insurance to the tune of 78.9%? Furthermore, 67.1% also believe that free enterprise results in high earnings. How do those three things square with one another? Hint, they don't, or at least not in any way that makes logical sense.
What we've got here is failure to communicate.
Well, before we go into any real detail, terms have to be defined, and that seems to be where we have the failure to communicate and understand the idea that is socialism. So what is socialism then? According to Merriam-Webster, the word has three potential meanings. Number one, any of various economic and political theories advocating collective or governmental ownership and administration of the means of production and distribution of goods. Number 2a, a system of society or group living in which there is no private property. 2b, a system or condition of society in which the means of production are owned and controlled by the state. Number 3, a stage of society in Marxist theory transitional between capitalism and communism and distinguished by unequal distribution of goods and pay according to work done. So let me get back to that 78.9% of Gen Z survey responders who support private healthcare insurance. How does that work with the definitions that we just outlined? It doesn't. It can't, and that means we do indeed have a failure to communicate about what socialism really is. Which begs the question as to what those who say they support the idea really mean. I mean, many on the left will say that they support socialism. Then you confront them about places like Venezuela or Cuba or other failed socialist states, and you'll hear them switch the conversation to places like Denmark, Finland, or Sweden. They'll tell you those are the real socialist states they're talking about. Here's where myth number 2 comes into play when defining socialism. None of these countries that today's American socialists would point out are actually socialist nations. Every single one of their economies strangely run on capitalism. Again, real socialism doesn't allow for private ownership of anything, period. That includes your ability to have the free will to be economically successful in the way that you see fit. You don't own property. You don't own your own labor. You don't own anything. How successful you are in a social society is more determined by what the government thinks of you than what your own free will does for you. Get in the right industry that's supported by the government, and you may be wealthy. Get stuck in an out-of-favor government industry? Well, you could probably suffer. The government picks the winners and losers in socialism, not your own free will to do with your life as you see fit. You don't need to take my word for it. Just listen to the people of those countries and their leadership as well. Let's just take Sweden for example, since Bernie Sanders and his democratic socialist friends like to point to that as a model of success. Was socialism really a success there? Well, would you consider the government releasing control of industry a success in socialism? Because that's exactly what happened. An article at Reason.com published earlier this year points out a little story for us all to remember. You and I likely know the story of Pippi Longstocking, right? Well, because of that popularity, Swedish author Astrid Lindgren actually saw her taxes on every new book sold come out to 102%. That's right, carry the 1, divide by 1,000. Yep, she was having to pay more in taxes than she was able to make by selling the book. I'd say that's all sorts of doing it wrong, but such was the state of taxes in Sweden's socialist government that did exist back in the 70s and 80s. Ingrid's 102% tax rate came because of not just income taxes, but then also having to pay employer fees. She got so mad that in 1976, she penned a satire piece aimed directly at the socialists in power. Later that year, thanks to the spotlight Ingrid placed on the Social Democrat Party, it was swept out of power. But just how powerful could ideology be? Despite the fact that Ingrid very personally felt the negative effects of socialism, she remained a social democrat up until the time she passed away in 2002. Her protest was the spark that ignited change in Sweden, though, because the citizens also saw that even that level of tax couldn't pay for the pensions they were supposed to be getting. In fact, they were supposed to be guaranteed. Change happened as private business took over the railways. Absolute vodka was allowed to be privatized. Yes, the government even controlled a spirits business. And government monopolies over large parts of industry were eliminated. Oh, and to really kick the socialist in the nuts over here in America, Sweden even eliminated the inheritance tax, reduced pension benefits to a sustainable level, doesn't have a national minimum wage, and has full-on vouchers for school, good for use for public schools, charter schools, and those dastardly for-profit private schools. Yes, that bastion of socialism is more free market than the United States of America today. Do you still want to hold up Sweden as the model of socialist success? Because I'm pretty sure real life history tells us it's a story of socialist fail and capitalist success ever since. But why do people like Bernie Sanders and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez still look at Sweden as a model of socialist success today then? It can't seriously be that they don't know this history. If that's the case, then why should anyone take a single thing that comes out of their mouth seriously? Well, the reality is that they could be in love with the welfare state that still exists in places like Sweden or Denmark. They still have government run healthcare, big pension benefits, and other guarantees from the government. But if they aren't truly socialist states, how do they get to paying for all that they give out to their citizens? We've been told for years it's all about high tax rates for Scandinavian countries. But what I find really interesting is just how little difference exists in taxes when it comes to the United States and those Scandinavian countries. According to the Tax Foundation, the top marginal tax rate in America was 46.3% back in 2015, and it was higher than that of Norway, 39%, and just 10% off the top rate in Sweden. Coming in 2019, America's top marginal tax rate will fall below that of Norway, down to 37%, but the point still stands. So, how are things so different in the eyes of socialists in America? The difference really comes in the form of how those tax rates are enforced. In the case of those Scandinavian countries, and this will really piss off Sanders and his ilk, the taxes are super flat. Everyone, regardless of their income levels, are paying high rates. Once again, from the Tax Foundation, quote, the top marginal tax rate of 60% in Denmark applies to all income over 1.2 times the average income in Denmark. From the American perspective, this means that all income over $60,000, 1.2 times the average income of about $50,000, would be taxed at 60%. Sweden and Norway have similarly flat income tax systems. Sweden's top marginal rate of 56.9% applies to all income over 1.5 times the average income in Sweden. Norway's top marginal rate of 39% applies to all income over 1.6 times the average Norwegian income. Compare this to the United States. The top marginal tax rate would kick in at 8.5 times the average US income, around $400,000. Comparatively, few taxpayers in the United States face the top marginal rate. Taxes are also a large part of the economy in Scandinavian countries compared to the United States. Consider this again from the Tax Foundation. Denmark 26.4%, Norway 19.7%, and Sweden 22.1% all raise a high amount of tax revenue as a percent of GDP from individual income taxes and payroll taxes. Yet, all we hear about from Bernie Sanders, AOC, and the socialist crowd is how the rich need to pay their fair share. Funny because the lesson from countries like Sweden and Denmark is that everyone contributing a large amount of their income, even the poor, gets them to the large social safety nets they've all agreed upon. You can't only heavily tax the wealthy if you want to get to universal health care and other socialist programs. What would have to happen is a complete overhaul of the tax code to the dreaded flat tax so many conservatives and libertarians have been calling for years. The disagreement would then be over the rates we tax as a country, with socialists clamoring for huge rates for everyone, and conservatives or libertarians looking to keep everyone's taxes low and the government intrusion into their lives low. What we are talking about is not socialism, it's simply tax policy in a capitalistic economy. Once again, the socialists aren't really socialists after all. Ultimately, the reality of support for socialism in today's Gen Z and millennial crowd can only be either a fundamental misunderstanding of what socialism is or true belief. Given what we've talked about today, I'd land much more on the former than the latter. The real question is, how do we combat the rising thought that socialism is a good thing? I say we need to scream to the rafters the history of places like Sweden and Denmark. Don't be afraid to confront feelings with facts, and don't be afraid to ask hard questions of those who say they believe in socialism. Alright, you fine folks, that does it for this week. As always, hit that subscribe button below, and don't be afraid to hit that notification bell so you actually see our episodes. Your action item this week is to share this episode some more. The more we grow this channel and community, the more shows I can produce. With that, don't forget to follow me on the socials at The Coppin Show across Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter.